So an opportunity came up to interview Jay-Z, but they didn't want any media to do it. So they came to me. It was all under the radar. I was at MTV. I just like left one day at my lunch break, like, I'm leaving. I'm going to interview Jay-Z. And for the Blueprint album, we spoke for like 3 hours. And he starts talking about this one song, and he's like breaking it down. They wouldn't let me hear the album before. So I was just sitting there listening to him. I was like, oh, okay. He puts a song out, and he dissed Nas. And then the album came out, and then I got to sit there and listen to it. And I was like, he just sat there and told me about this whole thing with him dissing Nas, and I didn't know because I didn't hear the song.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Music Lounge. We're back. I was feeling a little sleepy earlier, but wide awake right now. It's the best part of the day. How you doing, Perry?
I'm doing great, Andrew. Yeah, it's been we've been off for a couple of weeks as far as tapings go, but we've got a great lineup coming up. And today we're starting with somebody who was instrumental to me being successful at MTV, MTV.com, and MTV News. He was my hip hop mentor. And we'd like to welcome to the show Rahman Dukes, formerly the senior director of MTV News and currently the founder of Polaris, an entertainment and multimedia company. Welcome, Rahman.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Perry, my good friend Perry. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah.
Thank you for this opportunity to be a part of this. Love what you guys are doing.
Yeah. No, we've been talking about it for a while, so we're glad that you were able to join us, and I'm excited to get to talk to you. It's been a while.
Yes.
So I'm going to jump right in, and as I said, when I made the introduction, we met when I started at MTV Radio, MTV.com News in '99, I believe. That's when I started there. And, coming in to MTV at that time, my exposure to music had been, more on the pop rock side, but obviously rap and hip hop was huge and even getting bigger at that time.
Right.
It wasn't where my knowledge of music lied, but you, Shaheem, Hervé from Interscope were sort of my education on the music. But what was your journey into music, hip hop, and MTV?
Yeah, I had the blessing. I come from a very strong church background. I'm not necessarily all religious and holy, but I grew up in an AME Zion church. AME Zion churches and Baptist churches are predominantly where a lot of African Americans kind of came up through, going back to like civil rights, and when music is what really brought everyone together in this congregation. So about as far back as I could remember, like I came up through the choir. I was in all different realms of a choir. My parents was in a choir. Actually, when I was about 12 years old, I want to say like the entire like East Coast region of like these AME Zion church, like a collection of all like the kids who were like really invested into music and being in choirs, we actually put out an album.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we recorded an album. I'm gonna send you guys the picture. My mother just found like last year, but we like an official album, like all of us. It probably was about like 100 kids.
Wow.
So that was the beginning. And then probably when I got about like 15, I took one of my parents' turntable. They started making mixtapes, and where people, like down in New York City, Kid Capri, doo-wop, etc. And they had 2 turntables and they had a mixer. And so my parents had 1 turntable, and this guy said to me, who had 2 turntables, he's like, if you go to Radio Shack, you get a mixer. He was like, and you get a tape deck. He was like, you can fake it sort of. And so for the longest, so I learned how to DJ from using just 1 turntable and a tape deck and a mixer. Because Technique 1200s was the turntables then, and they were too expensive. Like we couldn't afford it. So I ended up doing that, and then I started like becoming a DJ. I was born upstate New York, very small community, and I was like 15 years old, and I started like throwing like house parties, and I eventually started putting together mixtapes, and I started selling the mixtapes, and I got enough money to buy the other turntable. Yeah, and then I went to school at St. John's University in Queens because I played basketball. A lot of us like music and sports was like the only way we thought was our way out of these environments that we were in. We didn't know nothing. I found out about college maybe like 2 months before I graduated from high school, and they just happened to send something in the mail, and I was a big basketball fan, and me and my father would watch a lot of like Big East, so it was like
Yeah.
Georgetown, Syracuse, and St. John's came in the mail, and I was like, I'm gonna apply for St. John's, and my father was like, you'll never make it there, and I did it, and I got it. And like the second year when I was there, I met a guy who was an alumni at St. John's, and he was actually a writer at MTV.com.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, just in like a random house party, I was super broke, ain't have no money, and this guy's like, "Oh, I come to MTV at internship." I was like, "Whatever," and he called me like a couple of days later, and I went down there, and that was the beginning.
When you started at MTV, was it in? Were you in news the whole time?
No, no, I
Okay.
wasn't. And it was interesting because when I started, I really again, like everything was, that's why it's such a blessing to look back on everything. Cause, when I talk about St. John's, it was a thing between, my thing was always trying to impress my father and prove him wrong. So when he's like, you can't get into St. John's, and it was did that. And when I told him about MTV, he was just like, there's no way. Like where we grew up at, we couldn't even get into TV. Like we didn't even
Mhm.
have BET. We had to travel like 10 miles to Albany. Albany is the capital of New York State just to watch BET. My aunt
Wow.
Right.
lived in Albany. And then when Yo MTV Raps had came out, again, I had a lot of cousins and stuff who lived in the city. So one of them had recorded 2 hours of Yo MTV Raps when it first debuted and put it on a VHS tape, and they brought it upstate. And I watched it, and like all my friends would come there and watch it. And it was like the biggest deal. So we all was like dubbing the tapes. And and that's something that like really sat with me because I'm like, I work for that place now. But the whole foray, like when I spoke to the gentleman who was a writer, his name was Dimitri Legier, really great guy. Wherever he is, hopefully he sees it because I never saw him again. Um, I came there, I did an internship, and it wasn't even with him. It was with another guy who looked like he was a little bit clueless, it turned out to be one of my good friends. His name is Greg Kaplan.
Mhm.
Greg
I
was a
remember Greg.
shooter. Yeah, so I think that I probably walked in the building. It was like, "Oh, we got this guy who's supposed to do an interview. Like, who's available?" And Greg was probably sitting in the corner, and they was like, "You go talk to him." I bet you that's how it happened. But me and Greg, so we talked, and then like a couple of days later, I got the internship. What I had told Dimitri, which really compelled him, why he thought it might be a good fit, because aside from doing music, I was also doing art. Like I'm an
Hmm.
artist. So I used to draw on clothes. Me and my sister, I look up to my sister. I get all my creativity from my sister Michelle. And we used to draw on clothes, and then we started selling clothes, and people would come to us, and we put like all the characters, Bugs Bunny with gold chains and everything
Oh,
on it.
nice.
Because there was a popular thing where a group of guys, their name is Shirt Kings from down in New York City, they had started doing this, and then they got so popular. People like LL Cool J and Salt and Pepper used to come and get custom clothes from them.
Wow.
And then they built like a little store in the Jamaica Coliseum. The Jamaica Coliseum just closed in January, which was devastating to any Queens natives. But
I
and they
heard
were
that.
they were a big part of it. So those two elements is was like what they felt like I was a fit for MTV because I was taking fine arts. Fine arts had migrated into graphic design. Graphic design, you needed computers. I never touched a computer until I was in my first year in college because again we couldn't afford it. That we just didn't have it like that. So once I got into computers, it was like okay. And then when I came to MTV, it was with MTV.com. That specific group, they were the beginning, the earlier stages of creating content.
Hmm.
They had a partnership with AOL for a partnership that AOL had called Intercast.
Hmm.
And AOL would produce like this weekly recap slideshow, what they called it, which was like MTV and Rock, like the news hits. It was compiled for the whole week and put into one show, so we had to publish it. And then we used their software, and so they were doing. It was a small group of original writers. They were doing some writing. It was very small and like really not that much video. So my job was to help them. Like there were tapes on beta tapes that was coming from TRL. They wanted to, Britney Spears might be on TRL. They want to take that clip and put it somewhere on the website. There was no original content. The majority of the original content at that time, we were on the 29th floor. That's where
Yeah.
MTV Radio was.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
And so MTV Radio, John Gill, Roger
Yep.
Coletti, Michelle, all of them, they were the one who was really capturing the majority of the content, but it was
Yep.
all on that audio. So at that time, I immediately, aside from Greg, I built a relationship with John Bartleson, who John Bartleson was the talent booker.
Yep.
John is also a DJ. So we kind of, we really got together because of that. And then he just saw like my insight about like music, and that was helping him with booking talent. And then we started talking to John Gill, who's doing all the interviews. It took a while for me to break through with John Gill, but again, me and John Gill, he's one of my best friends to this day. And I started doing interviews. He's like, "You can do an interview," and I was like, "Really?" So I started doing interviews, but I was just like having a conversation, like how we are. And then that was
Absolutely.
really just the beginning of it. And then it was. But me and Greg were like the midnight marauders, because like whenever everybody would leave the office, we like grab the cameras and like go outside, and we like shot with cannabis at the Statue of Liberty for the longest, and we would come back. These people were like, "When did you do this? Like, where'd you get this from?" And so it was. We were taking a risk at the time, but then like a year later, cannabis blows up, and they're like, "Oh, okay." And so that was really like the beginning stages of that. And then they were in the process of kind of trying to get MTV News off the ground and taking these articles that John Gill was writing these news briefs for and putting
Yep.
them on the website. So I just kind of stepped in and helped that. But I never wanted to be a writer. I wasn't a writer, and I wasn't necessarily a producer. And then us developing, just playing around with different things. John met some people, and they came up with an idea to put together a 15-minute audio show, which is what we call a podcast.
Yeah.
And we did a pilot. We brought Eminem in there. Eminem came in the middle of the night. He was small. He was small time then. Nobody really knew him, but the group we were working with, they had a relation, because Eminem was making his circles all around. He was going from like Rawkus Records, all these different places. So we built this pilot, and then Stretch Armstrong, real big DJ, he was
Yep.
the host. So we did like 2 shows, and then the third show we were supposed to do was an artist that Swain King Tech was managing, and they came all the way from the West Coast. And so when they got here, Stretch got sick. They wanted to cancel the show. I had told him, I said, "You should let that guy host the show talking about Sway." I knew he was on the radio. I never listened to him though. I was so New York centric. I wouldn't listen to nothing outside New York. So Sway came in and he did the interview. He knew Tech Nine, that was his artist. And they put it out, and a lot of other people heard it, because one of the things I always thought was fascinating about MTV is, you'd be in the hallways, like walking up and down the hallways. You see somebody down there and you walk right by and don't even look at you. And I'm like, okay, so people such as yourself, the reason why we developed this relationship, because you came in there, you were such a personable, likable person. You know what I'm saying? Like before you even got to training thoughts, it's hello, hey, how you doing? But after that Sway show, those same people who would walk by not saying that, they was all talking, "Who's that guy? Who's that guy?" And asking me. I didn't know Sway from a can of paint. They was like, "Can you get him here?" I was like, "Sure." I didn't know him. I was just happy that they was even talking to me. But I was like, "I'm gonna find a way to find out how we can get him back."
That's one of the things I loved about MTV, was because you could be hired to do one thing, and then they're like, "Oh, can you do this? And can you do this?" And all of a sudden, you've got all these skills, and you're working with all these different people, and you're bringing people in, and you're making these connections. It was a place where you could create your own future, basically.
It was.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes it gets a little lost because of, it's not so much as like the great work that was done, like the institution of like this foundation that a lot of us operate in the media space. When you talk about like MTV.com was the first place to build artist pages,
Yeah.
like
And
an
we built
artist
them
page.
by hand. I mean, we
Exactly.
were
That
hand
that
coding
was
those
one of my
pages.
first projects with Greg. I thought it was the most boring thing ever, and I didn't understand it. But when you look back on it now, like it's such a huge part of it. I remember we had conversations why it was important to put the writers' names on their articles.
Yep.
You know, when we was talking to Michael Alex about the importance of
Mm.
putting your own video player on your page that
Yep.
could be embeddable to go to other places.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's what we call viral. You know, so
Yeah.
there was a lot of that you know, and I've made a note that it's part of my duty to like point those things out, because you know, this was done by MTV gets all the credit for it, but it really was about the people.
Yeah.
And a testament to that is when you look at what everybody went off to go and do, like once they left there, you know, like look at yourself, you know, look at Tuma, look at Shaheem, look at Sway, you know, there's so many people who we could say her name. Look at Whitney, like, you know,
Yeah.
everybody, there's a lot of people.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think those are like staples of putting your name on an editorial piece. And, you know, I think you saying that you're not a writer, you still had that mindset of exploring where the short form pieces can live, because you saw they weren't being used on other platforms. MTV didn't have any red tape or, you know, corporate structure to prevent
Right.
you from experimenting with the music hours. We talked a bit about using short clips on MTV Jams between music videos and things that we take for granted now, seeing short form content. And I think you really were at the forefront of that in the music industry, you know.
And you know, and the other thing, and really got to give like Tuma credit to it, because it's something that still exists like right now to this day, which is part of the challenge within like television, how people see it fit. Like it was a thing where they couldn't match the success what was on linear versus what was on digital.
Yeah.
You know, they looked at it like they thought they after they finally accepted digital, you know, it was just bubbling on the underground for all these years. You know, once they accepted, they treated it as like a promotional tool, you know,
Yeah.
instead of figuring out like a real strategy. And the reason why I bring up like Tuma's name, because it was a really simple thought, but it's like it's really like the recipe for today within this ecosystem, which is you started with a digital product. Like we would take a piece of video content that was the centerpiece of an article we was writing. And Tuma, we took that same video and put it on MTV Jams. And then what Tuma did was create this whole other story around it by surrounding it with video commentary and all this other stuff. So you have the same piece of content, but it's entered in two different worlds.
Yep.
And you know, if you look at it now, like that's like what the challenge is. People
It's
make
the
big
yeah.
films, and then before the film comes out, they're like, we need to promote this online. You know what I'm saying? So they just put out some clips or etc. Instead of like really like taking the time and think about like a strategy, like how both of those successes could work. And it's something that still exists to this day. Like we took that same blueprint that what we did, me and Tuma. A lot of people don't know, you know, me and Tuma left MTV at the same time, at the same day. We went to the same place and we lived with each other and we worked
I
with each other in the same office
I did not know
for the
that.
whole first 2 years. Yeah. The person
Wow.
the person who hired us, who came from MTV, was talking to both of us. And
Right.
me and Tuma was like, we're damn near best friends, and we tell each other everything. And one time I'm talking to this guy, he's like, I just need a person who does music videos. And I was like, I think I got somebody for you. But Tuma is such a loyal person. I was like, he'll never leave MTV. And I was like, I didn't want to offend him. So when I
Right.
spoke to him, he was like, I'm already talking to them. I was like, oh my God. Like, and it was crazy because it literally, you know, it was for a common cause why
Right.
we
Right.
made the decision to move on, you know, and you really don't see some things like that. But when we went to the next place, we picked up that same blueprint. Everybody was talking about, let's do this TV show, big TV, throw this big budget, blah, blah, blah. We was like, do you see that property right there online? Which was one of them was the Breakfast Club. Another one was Drink Champs, you know, which was like one of the first, you know, urban podcasts to really get out there. And it's like, look at how far they've traveled now, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about it, you go back to it, it's like that's the stuff that what we was really doing with MTV, which a lot of it would not have happened without the relationships of the great talent department. This man right here, and Whitney and Wendy
Yeah.
and Sandra, you name it.
labels would come and they'd pitch stuff to the channel. And we've got this new artist, and we've got, they're gonna be huge, and the channel sometimes would be like, yeah, we'll wait until they get bigger, and then they'd come to us and I'd be like, bring them in. Let's start the relationship. Let's get going. Sometimes they were not, it was not something that really blew up, but sometimes it'd blow up so big, and it was
Right.
like the artists would remember that, and they would continue to do stuff with us because we were like there supporting them early. I mean,
They
that
really
was
appreciated still being under the umbrella of the MTV brand.
Right.
And I think when you're talking about MTV Jams, those were digital broadcast channels where,
Right.
I was doing MTV Hits and we really didn't have commercials. So we weren't prone
Right.
to
Right.
have to stick commercial breaks. We could really experiment packaging short form and music videos because we just had to fill time. So I think that outlet, apart from digital, allowed you to experiment with, like you were saying, putting short form content and building a story.
And I mean, and even like you mentioned, MTV Hits, like aside from MTV Jams, like MTV Hits, MTVU, MTV2.
Yeah.
It was such an interesting way how all of that was introduced to us, because we used to see all this when we was inside the office, but at that time, and this is how I got to understand distribution and how that worked, which was really helpful with the next place I went with, because I was involved in the conversations when they was having distribution meetings with different networks, etc. But so our understanding, like, we could only get MTV Jams in the building. I didn't really know that people can actually get that somewhere in the States.
Yeah.
So, after a certain point, we started getting our content, like some of the video pieces, like on the channel. We'd be in the office, and me and Shaim is in the office all hype, be like, oh, look at Shaw on TV, blah, blah, blah. And that was it. But then we go outside and everybody sees Sway, and they're like, Sway. So we're like, all right, whatever. We had a video. We went out of town to cover this shoot in Dallas one time. It was like this really big, like, new artist. He was so huge. And we showed up to the shoot, and it was in this big field, and it was so many hundreds of people. And the artist wasn't there. So we get out, and like I get out, cameraman gets out, Shaheen gets out, and everybody started going crazy. It's like, oh, that's the guy from MTV. And I was like,
wow.
oh my God. I was like, they get MTV Jams. I knew right away. I was like, they get MTV Jams out here. And then like that same weekend, we heard somebody like saying something about it on the radio. And it was like, MTV Jams is in town. I was like, wow. So I just felt like there was, as much as we love to see it, I was like, wow, there's an opportunity there.
Yeah.
So it was a real interesting thing just to see all that unfold.
We talk all the time on the show about how when you're at MTV and you're doing the day-to-day stuff, and you are, you're sometimes you're churning out content and you've got so much going on, but when you take the time to kind of step back and recognize like the people you're dealing with, whether it's like the biggest music artists in the world, label executives, managers, did you ever have that moment when you thought, okay, this moment I'm doing something that I will remember for the rest of my life?
Yes. When we sat down and it was a couple times, but one of them at the top of the list, when we sat down with Jay-Z and Nas together.
Wow.
When they did their joint interview. There's some more off the record stuff, but yeah, that was interesting to see the whole thing come to fruition, because MTV played a minor part. I mean, there was already tension and stuff, but there was a photographer, really good friend of mine too, but celebrity photographer, Johnny Nunez. Johnny and Waleed and a couple other guys, they were blessed where had these relationships with these artists, and they would go around and get all these exclusive photos, etc. But at that time, there was no social media or anything.
Mm-hmm.
So at the most, these pictures would go in these guys' press kit when their album came out. So we gave them a home where they started putting them on the website and
Yeah.
started putting them on the channel, and MTV wasn't letting us pay anybody, but we gave them a credit.
Yep.
And that went a
Right.
long way. But outside of that, like we built like a bond, like a brotherhood, and that traveled with us. So Johnny, at one point, he had came through and he had this picture of Jay-Z and Nas together. And it was Jay-Z and Nas like in a club holding champagne glasses. Jay-Z, one of them, I think is Nas wearing a blue leather vest or whatever. And that's like one of the only photos that ever existed of them together. And so we looked at it, I was like, that's an amazing photo. And then when everything came up where there was like tension brewing, etc., um, that's when I started telling John, it's like, that picture is going to be valuable. We had booked an artist who was signed to Nas. His name is Nature. We booked him for a radio interview. It was on a Friday. He came in the office and he sits there and we're talking, talking, talking. He's from Queens. I was living in Queens at that time. So we had mutual friends. At the end of the interview, he's like, we're shooting he's like, Nas is shooting a big music video in Queensbridge tomorrow. He's like, you should come through. I was like, all right, cool. So I told Whitney, and I was like, you should, call Sony, call Tony, see
Yep.
if we can talk to Nas. So we went to Queensbridge. And then at the end, we hung out to get the interview. So we go on the bus and we started talking to Nas. And mind you, we kind of had really no clue that all this was going on. And so, I'm talking to Nas and we get towards the end. And then I asked him because there was a song out that Memphis Bleak he made a line of reference and everybody felt like it was going at Nas. And so we were one of the first people, and Nas is the type of person never acknowledges. So we asked him, and he's like, yeah, he's like, that was about me, this and that. He was like, never let your enemy know what you think. He said, so now I understand. And that right there was like the first time that like it really went public. And again, we didn't really understand it. And then it just like completely took off. And fast forward, even funnier, at that time, one of my good friends who worked at MTV went to go work at Rockefeller. We had a really good relationship with Rockefeller. So an opportunity came up to interview Jay-Z, but they didn't want any media to do it. So they came to me, they wanted me to do it. So it was all under the radar. I was at MTV. I just like left one day at my lunch break, like, and I'm leaving. I'm going to interview Jay-Z, and for the Blueprint album. So I go there and I sit and I talk to him. We spoke for 3 hours. I was with him for the whole afternoon. We spoke for like 3 hours, and he's sitting there and he's talking, 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 and he's talking about the songs a little bit. And he starts talking about this one song, and he's like breaking it down. And they wouldn't let me hear the album before, so that was the trick. So I was just sitting there listening to him. I was like, oh, okay. And then so a couple of days later, 9/11 happened.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this was right before 9/11 because Blueprint came out on 9/11.
Yeah. Yeah.
His album.
Right.
And the day before that, he puts a song out and he dissed Nas. And then the album came out, and then I got to sit there and listen to it. And I was like, this motherfucker, he just sat there and told me about this whole thing with him dissing Nas, and I didn't know because I didn't hear the song. He broke the whole thing down to me, and I was just like, so it was interesting. I did see him at one point, like after that. It was like he just like walked by. I was at a party, and it was me and Shaheem, and he was with Beyonce actually, and he walked by. He walked right by us, and he turns around, and he comes back to us, and he like shakes our hand, and he talks to us. I was like, so that was definitely like a moment that like really sat with me, and then I got to see them together. And I literally had a conversation with Nas and said something to him about that time. And then I said something to Jay-Z about that too. So that was pretty dope.
Did you do the Wu Tang interview that we did?
I did a number of them. I primarily did the majority of those Wu Tang interviews. There was one we did on the Lodge deck.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's when ODB wasn't. They always there, but he wasn't.
Exactly. And I was
Method Man had the paper up in front of his face the whole time.
I did not understand at the time how big that really was to have all of them there to do that interview.
Yeah. It was because it's funny that you bring it up because I've gotten the opportunity to work pretty closely like with Meth over the past couple of years. I've seen him, and I brought this up to him because this is the first time, like you said, we had all of them together. that interview that we did with them, I think it was earlier in the morning. It was like 11 o'clock in the,
Mhm.
AM. And, they might have been a little groggy. Meth always was not the most media friendly person, but he literally sat up and interviewed the whole time with the newspaper over his face.
Oh, that was
And
Method Man.
and
That was Meth.
Method Man, sorry. And then I remember, sorry, Red. I know Red too. Like later on that day, probably like around 4 o'clock when it was TRL time, they're like, "Oh, we have Wu Tang in the house," and the first person they show is Method Man. He's all in the camera, all smiling, showing his teeth, and I was just looking at him like, this guy. I couldn't even get half that energy. And I believe that was later that night when they performed at, I think it was Irving Plaza, when like ODB like broke out of. He was in some type. He wasn't in jail. He was on. He was confined somehow, and he
Mm-hmm.
broke out and made an appearance at the show. So it was a
Jeez.
pretty wild day. But yeah, that was very big. That was very big.
Yeah, I remember I think it was maybe Theta who I booked it through,
Theta.
and and I she was really like, you don't understand how like monumental this really is, and I was
Yeah.
like, you're right, I don't, but to hear everybody say how big it was made me understand how big it was. Yeah.
No, it was, and just to show you how far that travels. I was around them maybe about three weeks ago because one of like the
Oh
founders
wow.
passed away. So they were all in town and for the funeral, and they had something after, and they were all there, and I was just sitting there looking like, because you don't really see them together that often. I saw them
Right.
Mhm.
last year at MSG, and even then I was just looking at them like, because I know Ghost and Ray like personally, like I do a lot. I've done a lot of stuff with them. They've been really really good with me, but seeing them all together, you rarely see that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So going back a little bit, we had Tom Freston on, and he was telling us when hip hop music first touched the channel, they were really constricting it to the overnights, and then as the '90s goes on, some of these artists, like you mentioned, Jay-Z, Nas, became more like mainstream towards the
Mhm.
MTV audience. And then we saw artists like Eminem and 50 and Lil Wayne that really crossed over to the pop world, entered TRL, and were up against and mixed in with pop stars like NSYNC and Britney and all of those. So, what do you think happened in kind of music culture that made that shift to hip hop, that made it more TRL friendly?
There was, well,
And obviously there was still the underground,
right,
the stuff that MTVU and Jams were playing that really didn't have a place. But the big artists that started underground, like
right.
a Jay-Z and Nas, shifted gears to the mainstream.
Yeah, there was a time, and you mentioned Tom. God bless Fred Jordan. I'd love to hear Tom talk about Fred Jordan. Fred is a guy who played a very big part in that. Just MTV really embracing hip hop music,
Yep.
hip hop and R&B, and
Mhm.
then and just like the MTV support and how it exploded. And I never try to live back in times, but I'll bet if Fred was around, like MTV would have got a lot more credit for that.
Mhm.
Fred was a
Mhm.
guy when Lauryn Hill won all those Grammys, like she thanked Fred.
Right.
Wow.
D'Angelo,
I didn't know
D'Angelo,
that.
yeah, D'Angelo was Fred's roommate. You know, after D'Angelo's first album, he disappeared like for a while, and
Yeah.
part of that was in due because of Fred's death.
Oh
Because
man.
just being traumatized by that. Like
Sure.
Fred was a guy who took myself under the wing and a couple other gentlemen, Ramon Bug, Arthur Lee, a bunch of them who ended up leaving and going over to BET. This was right around the time Stephen Hill left and went to BET.
Hmm.
You saw the incredible work the way he did. So that plays a part into where I was going. Hip hop in the earlier stages was all about acknowledgement and like the story of the struggle. Like these are people who took something from out of nothing and made it good, and this is feel good vibes, it's different type of energy. Like basically hip hop basically came from Jamaica, came from Cool Herc. Cool Herc's Jamaican. He's the first one who did it. He happened to be living in the Bronx on Cedric Ave. That's where it came from. But then it got to a point where it's like, let's make it look more flashy. Then hip hop was always rooted within the streets. You looked up to the bad guys. You looked up to like the drug dealers. Like some of these drug dealers was funding some of these record labels that started from the ground up. That became some of the biggest record labels we know to today. So that element always existed, but then it got to a point where it became about being flashy, who had more money, like
Yeah.
who had the nicest cars, and a lot of that's credited to Jay-Z. You know, when Jay-Z came out, Jay-Z started talking about Cristal. He started talking about champagne. It was an expensive champagne. Everybody's like, oh, let's go and get this expensive champagne and be like him. You
Right.
know, and then you had people like Bad Boy and Puff Daddy who's like, well, I've been had the most money, so let me really show you what money looks like. And then when those two started going back and forth with it, and then you had like Biggie who came into play, who was one of the biggest artists,
Yep.
you know, and Biggie came like right during the time of Wu Tang and Fugees, all these other groups. They weren't necessarily like doing the money thing, but they were starting to be like some of the biggest hip hop artists, like sales, etc. Biggie matched that caliber, but he took like this lifestyle and introduced it to this culture. And then it also like started introducing this street element to it too, this violent element, which you see what happened with him, what happened with Tupac. You see what's happening right now on social media. If
Yeah.
you look at people who's on social media and all these kids are talking about guns and this and that and having much money, a lot of that comes back to bragging about having money, which comes back to these guys. Um, and then after a certain point, and a big part of this is MTV's fault, not your fault, but because other people wouldn't listen to us. These artists got so much bigger that they was like, we don't need MTV support. That made your job harder, right? When we
Yeah.
started, you know, when Jay-Z plays at the Yankee Stadium show with Eminem, we can't get interviews now because they don't need it. You know, and not only that, like they ended up starting to get educated. And I started seeing this firsthand. Me and Shaheem, like they'll tell you, you know, from the stuff that what we were doing on the site, you start seeing it pop up at World Star, and then you started seeing artists, big artists, investing into video placements on World Star to being like,
Right.
I'm gonna do this on my own, which is like
Yeah.
50 Cent starting This Is 50. You see where he's at right now.
Right.
But it's like if those things were there right within MTV, then you know there still would have been like that bond, that relationship that was still there. But at the same time, the part of the issue too was, you know, and it's like how we're sitting, we're talking right now. Like there was a lot of division. You know, you had like MTV, you know, like the website that was generating a lot of the content, like building a lot of their own relationships, but really the heart and soul of like MTV was like music and talent. You know, like you guys booked the award shows. That's all the majority of the artists really cared about was performing at the VMAs and getting their videos played.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That none of that had to do with us.
Um, do you think that also the how big videos became and how expensive they became played a part into how it sort of transitioned from more like a street thing to showing off money too? Like, you know, a lot of those videos were like millions of dollars shot on yachts and
Absolutely,
this
But that was
thing
an
and that
outlet for
thing.
them
And
to show their money, wasn't it?
yeah,
Cars and just to be
yeah,
over the top. But I guess
yeah,
it was a
and Brad,
lifestyle.
it was all bragging rights. And
Yeah.
again, you know, as much as I hate to say it, but you know, it's because I come from the culture. But a lot of this is the result of oppression. You know, this is because of literally living out being minorities. There was always this claim of when I get something, I have to speak loud and clear about it instead of just having it. So when you get a nice car, you don't just drive around in your car. You gotta roll your windows down and turn your music up. Like I got the best car on this block. I got the,
Right.
and it's just like, you know, and that's just a mentality that stuck with us because of the oppression. You know that what was dealt with, and you know the other part of it too is that, you know, this part of the culture is also the only part of the culture that don't necessarily work with each other. Like it's a lot of isolation, that's within there. And technology also played a very big part in all of this too, at the same time, because there were discoveries that people saw all throughout the ways where that's where they started boxing out not just MTV, but like a lot of these institutions. They're like, we don't need to go to MTV to get music videos played anymore because we can get it placed on YouTube now at this point. But things like Napster was like really the start of it. And God bless Tom. I'm sure that he touched on Napster, right?
Yep.
And because that's looked at as being like a real turning point too. With the MTV, like Undercover at that time, it wasn't really that well known, but like now looking back, like the Napster, MySpace time, like that was really like the beginning that kind of started setting this tone for when things started going a little bit separately. But yeah, those guys like Hype Williams and God bless them because they got the big checks, but people just wanted a Hype Williams video. They wanted,
Yeah.
they wanted this, they wanted that. Again, a lot of it was on the record labels too, because they didn't like officially educate a lot of these artists. They didn't have them understand that we gave you this advance, but this is not your money. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? And like what their deal points meant and what's going to happen with your career once this partnership ends. They ain't gonna talk to you about that. But it's like that's the majority of what a lot of these people dealt with. So then they start looking around, and they're like, okay, well, my music videos used to be played at MTV or, wherever, BET, all these different places. Like, what rights do I have and all that stuff? So, I mean, it's unfortunate how all that played out, like that. But I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a challenging one to answer because I see
Hmm.
a light at the end of the tunnel. Like there's always a positive outcome, but the way things go now, like there's no guardrails and
Right.
and it has the opportunity to go really, really bad, like go off the course.
We've talked about music being supported by what we call middle America. And I think outside of the pop and rock, I think hip hop was really accepted in those areas that might have had mass distribution. And, it's an outlet for the youth to really put yourself into that elaborate lifestyle and live it whilst watching these videos that you've never seen before. So I can
Right.
imagine how fans of pop stars gravitated towards these catchy hip hop videos because the music may have been, oh, we can now gravitate towards this culture and audience. So let's make our music a little more pop friendly. But I think other kids just really accepted different genres and, it was just, a lifestyle that they didn't have that they could
Yeah, it was a
spaced out for a few
it's a
minutes.
fascination thing. Yeah, they
Yeah.
were,
Yeah.
And,
but that I always saw that like growing up.
yeah,
Again, I grew up in a really like predominantly suburban type area.
yeah,
It was probably like three different neighborhoods, which was filled with like all the black people,
yeah.
and just growing up, like just people outside of our race, they were always obsessed with us, like how we dressed,
Fashion, yeah, 100,
and
yeah,
you've seen that evolve like over the course of the years, and so artists they know that they definitely know that, but the challenge that they got was you would feel in their mind they're like they love what we do so much we should be able to put this out unfiltered and they'll just eat it up.
hmm,
But their challenge was no, you have to contextualize this so this can go out and be like presentable. You know what I'm saying? Like in a public atmosphere. And
yeah,
that's something that, you asking somebody like aside from asking to put out music like that, them themselves as a human being might not even be like that. They haven't even grown up like that. So you're asking them to not only make a musical change, but a personal life change within themselves. So
yeah,
that was what a big part of what that struggle was. And for me too, when I was during the time at MTV, the job grew to a point where we part of the job was paying attention to the audience,
Right.
and the consumption behavior, and some of the stuff that I just could not wrap our heads around was like who exactly was the people who was like reading, like our viewers, like who was reading
Yeah.
this stuff, who was watching it.
Hmm.
Because when I get around my people who's just like me, etc., again, they don't even have computers.
Right.
Like a lot of them didn't have cell phones. Like they sure don't watch MTV. They don't even watch BET.
Yeah.
Like they'll listen to the radio, and then when mixtapes became popular, they listen to mixtapes and stuff. They go to shows, and they go to barbershops and talk about it. The barbershop thing is a real thing. But there was so I it was a thing, but and then I think that the music, like music industry, meaning like labels, etc., I think they overdid it by like drilling this into artists' head, like you have to make this pop record, etc. I think that really did hurt music a lot. And
Well, it was
you see that because look at streaming. Like a lot of people just put out whatever they want, and some of it just works.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's pretty telling.
I think part of it too was the success of TRL, and they knew that they wanted to get music and videos played on TRL. That also helped. That influenced the decision to maybe go in a more pop route with maybe like a 50 Cent. But they also opened the door for like Jay-Z would get on TRL. It was so much of what we talk about on this podcast comes back to TRL and how influential that really was in the culture and in the music business at that time.
Well, it got to a
So
point where it got to a point where it was about the ratings and the revenue.
yeah,
I was just
You
getting
know?
ready to say this because when you say TRL, right? In the end of the day, it comes down to the sponsors.
yeah.
They're like, is this acceptable or not to this sponsor or not? And there was a mentality for the longest that existed. And then there's other different flashpoints, but one of the biggest flashpoints that you've been seeing a response from the past 2 years is something like post George Floyd, when DEI, which I don't believe in DEI stuff, there was a lot of activity where black businesses, like black brands, like everything black got this attention from some of the biggest brands that they've never gotten forever. And I can even attest to that for myself because as long as I was at MTV, like I had to go to the Essence Music Festival to understand like how brands work within media and our specific space, like with content, because we was
Mm-hmm.
capturing stuff. We went to go put it out, and people were like, "No." And Essence is brand central, So, but what it showed was that you you could bend those rules when you want to. You know what I'm saying? Like that was a little bit, and then it's like then it was kind of taken back. And by the way, I'm not biased. It doesn't bother me at all because the whole DEI thing and all that stuff, like that's whatever. Like you don't even need that. It's just equal and fair rights in the end of the day. But a
Yeah.
lot of it was about like the sponsor.
But what I will say is a lot of those hip hop artists were the very first people to understand how they could brand themselves because it was
Exactly.
with
Exactly.
clothing, it was with
Exactly.
liquor, it was with production companies, it was with so sports, it was with so many different things,
Fashion. Yeah.
and and they were like it set a template for how everybody else in the entertainment business started to operate. And it really came from like those like the Jay-Z's, like the 50 Cents, all of those guys who knew that, listen, I can put G Unit on anything or I can put
Right.
Bad Boy on anything and it's going to sell.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that all comes back to like the whole element of like street team promotions when you used to
Hmm.
see, like Bad Boy used to have the signs, the picket stick signs, Bad Boy with the logo, etc. And another thing too was politics. When I was at MTV News and they had Choose or Lose, and God bless everyone who was involved in Choose or Lose. Choose or Lose was kind of like part of Docs. So us being in news, we didn't
Hmm.
necessarily touch
Yeah.
everything that was in Docs. But Choose or Lose was kind of like a territory that we weren't really a part of. we didn't really feel accepted to be a part of it. And during that time, there was just a lot of messaging about, politics, etc. So our way into it, we just one time, like me and Shaheen was doing an interview, and at the end was just like, "Who you gonna vote for president?" And the person answered, and we put that out, and we got such a huge response. It was crazy.
Wow.
So then we kept doing it, and that ended up being so big. At a certain point, the people from Choose to Lose was like, "Can we use your tape?" It was like, "Of course." I was like, "No problem." But like, we're all in this together. Like, don't forget, Barack Obama, like, he Puff interviewed him. You know what I'm saying? Like, through Choose to Lose. That was his.
Wow.
Forget the name of who the person was, but I'm just saying, like, within that lens, though.
Yeah.
And I think that that said a lot. As far as like the impact and the influence. But again, shout out to MTV though for being the ones behind that.
Yep.
Because if you look at like Kanye West, people thought that, Kanye was, delusional or whatever when he was running for presidency. But he planted some seeds right now that's what's really like thriving. Those seeds that he planted and during that he might not have won, but he's winning now in the sense of just that these things that he put out in that universe. And there's real people, there's a real threat and a force behind that. It's, so it just goes back to it. It's because they followed his music.
We've talked about, and even Freston mentioned this to us too, MTV allowed creative people to be creative. What was one or maybe a couple of things that you were most proud of your time doing in your time there?
Well, the first one, and this is how I actually ended up like really, really getting like a full-time job, because I was a rare situation. I was probably one of the youngest people. Like, I was working at MTV when I was 17. I was interning when I was 17
Wow.
because they thought I was a little bit further along in school than I was. They never checked. So, I'm like, whatever. They asked me for a resume. I gave them a resume, and so it was the end of my first year in college. And, I went back to St. John's and I told them, I was like, I'm being offered this internship. They was like, it's a great opportunity. You weren't supposed to take an internship till your last semester of your final year. Because I was art major, I was really going to be there for 5 years, 4.5 instead of 4.
Mm-hmm.
So they let me take it. So during that 2 years, and I was working at MTV.com, like, I was still going to school. I was going to school on Mondays and Thursdays, and I was going to MTV those other 3 days. So towards the end, like when it was getting close to me graduating, MTV had their first hip hop week. And this is when they, like, everything, like the website was like, it was like a full takeover every day. And the channel too, they had a guest coming in TRL live every day. So the website, how it was built, it was really just matching. It was like TRL's website, basically,
Right.
in a
Right.
nutshell, with other little things in there.
Yeah.
So I was writing, doing some interviews, doing a little bit of writing here and there. So Jen Schonborn, God bless Jen, love her to death. She was like, I want you to write all the copy for the website for the week. She was like, I'm gonna help you with it. And all the different sub pages, the home pages. So I wrote everything. Like, I wrote everything, and then I sat with the designer and I went through like all the designs. And like I said, I was going to school for this at that time, and I'm like in front of computers. I would see the
Amazing,
design,
yeah.
and I was never able to touch it, and it was like killing me. You know what I'm saying? It's like an up and coming artist like sitting in the studio with Jay-Z, like, trying to contain themselves. But so when she came to me, she put that trust in me. I did it. We wrote everything, like, and it was like really short stuff, wasn't in depth, like all these different promos, and did all these interviews. And probably like the week after that, I want to say, one of these other guys who always used to be walking up and down the hallways, never speaking. There was another one. He comes up to me one day, and I'm like, he talks like, and it was Michael. It was Michael Alex, and he's like, "You wrote all this stuff?" And
Wow.
I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, oh, "Okay." He was like, "I'd love to talk to you." And I was like, "All right, cool." So then we ended up talking, and he was telling me how they were looking for a writer to come in and be like a full-time like hip hop writer,
Mhm.
etc. I was like, "I'm not a writer." I said, "But I can help you until you find one." And then he's like, all right, cool. I was like, but I'm still in school. He's like, oh, this isn't. I was like, but they've been letting me do a part. He's like, no, this 5 days a week. I was like, well, I graduate on Monday, and I mean on
Oh,
Sunday. And he
perfect.
was like, okay, so you can start on Monday. So
Wow.
I graduated that Sunday, and that Monday, that's when I started. And that was like the real full-time job. So it was that one. And then when I was working with them, we would every now and then, like when an artist had a big album come out, we would do like a feature on the
Hmm.
website. And I think it was Method Man's his debut album. And we literally, me and one of the designers from MTV.com put together a comic book with Method Man. And I wrote all the captions, and then we got with Method Man and he read all the captions. So it was a clickable like comic book, so that was dope. And I was with them in October. Mass Appeal put out a comic book of like a bunch of the guys who's like signed to Mass Appeal. One of them is Raekwon, but like Method Man's in it or whatever. So that was pretty cool.
I
Nice.
I don't remember that
And I
comic book.
actually have one more.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that is the last one I'll share. When we were working on the Jam Master Jay case, um, which by no means we never got into it. The intention that we just wrote a story about somebody who we looked up to. We're from Queens. I lived up the hill from where the studio was at. So it was a big passion. We had started reporting it, and people who was close to him saw it. They felt like these are guys that we know we can trust. So we ended up building this trust, doing a lot of interviews with people. We ended up meeting this one gentleman we kept hearing about, who was a real close friend of Jay's, who's actually one of my really good friends now too. This was one of the last people Jay was with. He was with him out of town, and then the next morning he got a call. Jay got a call, and he like just left in a hurry. Go back to New York. A couple hours later, he went to the studio. That's when everything happened. He left behind his pager. He had a beeper back then, so he left that there. So when I spoke to Jay's friend, my friend as well, and we went out to go interview him. We stayed at his house. We sat there with him for some time, and then he eventually um, he's like, he wanted me to help him with it, like getting the thing activated again. So I ended up getting it activated, getting it turned on, meaning, and yeah, I actually had like a viable piece of important products, like within like that case. And not too many people really knew about that at all. But it was all trustworthy. I only share it with you guys, but that was a very, very real situation. Very
So
interesting.
I know this is a digression and I'm just curious, I know two people were convicted, but didn't they have their convictions overturned or something or no?
No, so two gentlemen were arrested and went to trial, and they were convicted. Um, One of the gentlemen who they claim was the actual shooter, um, they used a certain strategy to arrest him. They arrested him on drug charges.
Mm.
So he managed to get the drug charges thrown out, which voided the
Hmm.
murder conviction. So yeah,
Oh.
he's currently applying for bail. Like by the
Wow.
time this comes out, he could be out. Um,
Okay.
I'm sure that the government is doing whatever in their authority to stop that from happening, and
Yeah.
who knows? But yeah, it's pretty crazy.
You've had a great career and you're still continuing to build and grow, I'm sure. So when you look at what you're doing now, how do you feel that a lot of your previous roles have really led you to have the toolkit to be able to do what you're doing now in your current company? And can you speak a bit about what
Yeah,
that is and what projects you're kind of currently working on?
yeah. A lot of it really started when I was at MTV, when just built like a trust amongst just a number of individuals, and because of the position that myself and Shaheem were in, Shy came from a print background, and that was really like magazines was really the source of where
Yeah.
we got like all of our information, like the Source, the
Hmm.
Vibe, then eventually Double XL. When the internet came, the internet kind of it crashed publication. The writers at those publications, prior to the internet, dominance, they were like, they were really well respected journalists. Like when how people look at Anderson Cooper and all these other journalists, that's how they looked at them. And so that was like a thing where people really wanted to become a journalist, become a writer. Shy was following along that path, and Shy had an opportunity to come and try out for a job at MTV.com. And what he ended up doing was he just leapfrogged over that entire journey right there, because all of those writers ended up coming to digital, becoming,
Yeah.
because that was the way of the land.
Yep.
And not only Shy being a writer on digital, he also became one of the first people on air, like a writer. You see all that all around. Nobody else was on TV. Like,
Yep.
that, Barry, the internal wars that we had to go through to keep him on TV.
Yep.
You know, so, but seeing those elements, it was like we could form our own team. That mentality was always there. And then going the routes of placing content on MTV Jams and creating this level of success and people not necessarily being aware, and then seeing like ad inventory and how we was boxed out of that, missed opportunity. When I went to the next place, I was like, gonna learn that, gonna learn distribution, just understand like the overall concepts of like a company, like, what it's supposed to do within itself. And then after that, we had got an opportunity where like fast channels had really become a thing. And this is like right during COVID, like toward like the end. And some people came to us from Vizio, specifically within a sales team, and they knew that we knew how to run a channel. They had a strong appetite because, like I said, they probably had a bunch of potential sponsors from like
Hmm.
brands who wanted to target like an audience that we've been thriving in.
Yep.
So we kind of helped them do that. We built a partnership, built a full channel. But what the full intentions was, aside from having our own thing, it was really about ownership. It was about ownership. It was about showing, because we felt like we put ourselves in a position where we were looked at as sort of like ambassadors. And I mean like myself, Shaheem,
Hmm.
Sway, uh, Whitney, Tuma, Joseph Patel. There's a bunch of us.
Yep.
So, and we was like, well, if they see us doing something, like people will follow to a degree. So that was what it was really about. We're real editorial journalists at heart. We felt like we could help rein in a little bit of the editorial, like provide like a guide. That's where the name Polaris comes from, which is like a star that you
Hmm.
use for like a guide. So we did, so it was really a lot about ownership. I still was working with MTV, and we still have relationship. To that point, I came in to relaunch Your MTV Raps. The podcast version was working with the on air team, and during that time, that's when I was one of the first people to really like help build out the infrastructure, and a big contributor to the MTV library.
Hmm.
There was a lot of conversation like, all the videos is gone from, all the content is gone from the website. I was like, people don't know, but it was gone for a minute. The articles was always there, but the
Right.
videos had long been removed. Because I'm the internet geek, I know how to punch in like the actual URL, and you could see that stuff. But not anymore though, but at a certain point. But just in that process, it was a lot of just ownership conversations, etc. And we came to the end of our partnership with Vizio. It was a 3 year option. We picked up the option, but we didn't put the channel out. We created a partnership with Byron Allen
Oh
for his
wow.
HBCU platform. Yeah, so we're partners with Byron Allen. Byron, his AMG network. It was specifically for HBCU Go, which the content also mirrors on the channel, the Griot. The Griot was originally a website. Byron had a channel, and then he renamed it the Griot. He brought the staff there. So a lot of the content goes on there as well. So there's a linear play and there's a fast channel play. And then with HBCUs, it was really about, getting more diverse into that community as well, getting in right in front of students, and just them hearing from someone who has this knowledge and experience, like taking their proper content and putting it out there. I myself, I never went to an HBCU. My older sister went to an HBCU. She went to Morgan. I'm like, I grew up as damn near HBCU. I am historically black. I don't need to go to a college to get a piece of paper. Like I'm good in life.
Yeah.
But it's a great experience, and it's been great like working with Byron as well. But again, it just reinforced ownership. So literally, like for the past 2 years, myself and a small team, we started building our own tech. So we built like our own player and our own infrastructure, and we partnered with it's a massive ad sales team, but they're more independent, it's more intimate. They've worked with all these different networks, so we plug these two together, which is everything that what we own 100%. And yeah, we put together the package for the channel, and we're rolling the channel back out. We're actually rolling it out next month. Well, this month,
Wow.
on like 8 different networks from Roku, Samsung, Vizio, Fire TV, LG, and then we're also going to spin it into OTA as well. OTA is over the air. That's how
Yep.
TV originally started, with antennas.
Yeah.
OTA introduced a new software about 2 years ago that has been a lot where a lot of media has started going towards. And this new component actually entails audio as well. So you can actually get a signal and like in your car, etc. And
Wow.
OTA is really like it's starting to like be like of like big dominance, because fast channels and cable, like a lot of it's just really gotten expensive, and fast channels is a very
Mm-hmm.
crowded space.
Yep.
So you need like a real unique strategy to put on top of it. So OTA is that. So yeah, hopefully like next year there'll be another radio station in New York.
That's
All right.
awesome.
Yeah.
Talk about someone who's self-made, Byron Allen. That's amazing, huh? I mean, what
Yeah,
that guy has accomplished.
yeah, Byron is I mean, I've had the I worked with a very controversial name, Sean Combs, from him, but just being around him, like we've been around a lot of these guys are, it's not just about just Puff, a lot of them are all, it's a lot of because of the backgrounds and the upbringings, and no excuse for anybody, but you know, Byron, Puff, Jay, a lot business acumen you talk
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
Um, there's a real
50
drive right
Cent
there.
even.
50 Cent.
Yeah.
You could go on. It takes a lot as an individual to even succeed at a certain level. Now, how you get there and other things like that's on them. But Byron specifically, Byron has a really incredible story, because you talk about this is a guy like his mother really came up in the music business. She worked in film studios, and she used to bring
I
Byron. She used to
I
bring
didn't
Byron to
know
work
that.
with her. Yeah. She
Oh,
used to bring him to work, and so he got that experience when probably before he was like 10 years old or something like that, and from starting out in comedy
yeah.
to just invading like this television landscape, like getting all these properties and
Mhm.
being super smart about technology, being super smart about ad sales, inventory, and marketing, and now, within the past couple of years, which he always has, but being more vocal, and with people such as myself, just what he's doing, like for the community, like for the African American community, and not even just African American community, like using himself as an example of
Mm-hmm.
success.
Mm-hmm.
And during these times, when you see something like that story coming from people who look like him, to this environment, like it's important. Like that stuff is what's needed. He just, there was a recent. He just got a major involvement within Stars, like so he's a part owner, within Stars, and
Wow.
it's a lot of good stuff going on.
But listen, you're an example too. I mean, with everything that you've got going on too. I mean, it's pretty incredible actually.
Well,
So,
we
I
just
kudos and
trying.
congratulations.
Thank you. I tell you, it's interesting, and it's not even just myself. Like I speak for. There's a lot of really, really like talented people who we work with, who I came around with, from writers, producers, photographers, and they put so much work into the game, and now like a lot of them are still trying to figure it out,
Mm-hmm.
etc. And a big part of what this purpose of what we're doing is being a part of this, us being a part of them, us working together. You know what I'm saying? Us working together, like making moves together, getting money together, but
Yeah.
building something together. Building something together so that we can show that it's a division more than the shit that what you see on YouTube and social media
Yeah.
or something. So, and if I have to use I'm the guy who sits in the background. I let Sha do that stuff. He like to be on the camera. He'll probably pop in any minute. No, I'm just kidding. But for a cause like this, like, I always be vocal about it. And thanks to people like yourself, for trusting in me and believing me. And I tell people all the time, I would not be in the position I am. Like there was because for the first year, like 2 years when I was at MTV, and it's funny because I see people like 10 years, like 10, 15 years after the fact, and they tell me stories during that time. And I'm like, wow, that really almost happened. And like, it was, I felt like there was like, I had no allies. It was like a couple people, but it was really challenging. So when you met like genuine, sincere people, I always carried that like, with me in my heart, like over the course of this year. And it just showed that like, aside from doing good work, like you do good work with good people. That
Yeah.
makes better work.
Yeah.
So thank
Absolutely.
you to you too.
Now, I think we've heard everything today, Rahman. So thank you so much for taking the
No
time to
problem.
speak with us. This was
No problem.
awesome.
No, I
Yeah.
appreciate it. And I'm glad we finally got to do this. And
Yeah,
hopefully,
absolutely.
we do some stuff too. I love what you guys are doing, and I love when people are self-made. And I'm looking at you right now, and y'all look like you enjoying it, and that's really what it's about.
I
It's
mean,
nothing better to do what you love to do. You know what
I
I'm
mean,
saying?
the impetus for all of this was, one, to learn something new and to have something to sort of put out on social media about what we're doing. But more than anything, it's been for me, the best part has been reconnecting with people that I enjoyed working with, that I respected, and that I knew had good stories to tell. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think,
And
this is no, I was just going to say, this is a time of our lives where we've worked our way. We've
yes,
had some shitty jobs in our career, but we found our love connection. And, you shouldn't go through life doing jobs you hate. You do what you love.
yes. But this month, yes, check us out. Polaris, Polaris. Go to Roku. Fire TV, Samsung, Vizio, LG, anything else you want to add to the mix. Wherever your mama get her nails done, hair done, feet done,
Love it.
everything. We are there. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.
no, thank
Appreciate it.
you. Thank you. And just as a closing to anybody listening, please remember to rate, review, like, and share podcast. And we will be back soon with another episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you for joining us today in the Music Lounge.
And tune in next week to hear more stories about your favorite era of MTV.